Tonight's presentation is done Reader's Theater style because we wanted to get as much as possible into it. There will be visuals, there will be sound. I'm glad you all decided to come and enjoy this. Pay attention to what the readers are saying because you will be surprised at what our town has accomplished. All of us were. The playwright for this is Bill Gebbe. William Gebbe is out of Indianapolis and he's somewhere in the audience out there. Bill, are you out there yet? Have you met? Hi, Bill. Stand up. He's back there. Thank you, Bill. Over a year of research was done for this, so you can imagine how much effort it took. All of the cast members have participated in the script. Some of it is from their own words. Some of it is from our words from other people who have submitted. So I hope you enjoy it. There will be a 5-minute intermission. You'll know because the actors will walk off stage. And now, 200 years of history of Connorsville, Indiana. Thank you.
Okay. May 7th, 1800. Indiana Territory is established by an act of Congress. Vincennes is made its capital. William Henry Harrison, its governor. The territory includes what are now Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and parts of Ohio and Minnesota.
That portion which will become Indiana is dark, dangerous, and densely forested. Gigantic trees hide everything from bogs and swamps to black bears and panthers. No roads, just Indian trails, buffalo traces, creeks, and rivers. No towns, just blockhouses, trading posts, Indian villages, and a few white settlements.
The Miami Nation claims every inch of it, but they're not the only Indians around. They've even given permission to the Potawatomi, the Kickapoo, the Shawnee, and the Delaware to settle amongst them. The most peaceful of the tribes, the Delaware, settled on the banks of the White River. The village of Chief Bukongahangas was one of the most important of these settlements. It's home to a young white trader by the name of John Connor.
A Moravian missionary named Abraham Lukenbach remembers being invited to spend the night with John Connor and his Delaware wife in May of 1801. After being settled in the couple's log house, Lukenbach was invited to attend a ritualistic dream dance in the village. He wrote in his journal, Connor appeared to be very much taken with the dance. He said that the Indians in this way sought to serve their God and that many of their dreams had been fulfilled. He himself danced with them and had not gotten much further in knowledge than the heathen.
Unbeknownst to Lukenbach, John Connor had been raised in the missionary village of Schönbrunn in western Ohio. Connor's parents had done their best to raise their children God-fearing Moravians, but things changed for John after he left home to make his living as a trader. At age 26, John Connor dressed, acted, and thought like an Indian. This changed, however, when he traveled to Washington with several Indian chiefs to negotiate peace.
One of the first stops on the journey was Goshen. It was there Connor became reacquainted with David Zeisberger, the Moravian missionary who had baptized him as a child. Spending time with Zeisberger and later the philosopher President Thomas Jefferson made Connor realize that the world was a much larger place than he had come to believe.
Shortly after returning to Monongahela's village, John decided to travel on the southeastern part of Indiana that had been purchased from the Miami in 1795. Accompanied by his wife and several Indian friends, he journeyed to Cedar Grove Creek in 1803 and established a trading post that made him accessible to both white immigration and which would become a flood when the 12-mile purchase allowed entry rights into the Whitewater Valley. In 1831, Connor built another trading post on the present site of Connorsville in 1808.
According to J.L. Heinemann, the trading post stood above what is now 8th Street, near the west end of Charles Street, and exactly in the middle of Eastern Avenue. It was a large wood structure surrounded by a high, sturdy wall. During the War of 1812, it housed a detachment of soldiers and became known as Connor's Fort.
1812 put John Connor's dreams of expansion on hold. The trader became a full-time scout, interpreter, and soldier under the command of William Henry Harrison. The situation in the American Northwest was perilous. The British made full use of the Indians' hatred of the white immigrants who were settling on land that belonged to the Miami Nation and its allies. The charismatic Shawnee chief Tecumseh engaged Governor Harrison in a literal battle to the death. Indiana became a land of massacres, battles, and sieges. When the fighting was over, the Northwest wasn't only lost to the British, but also to the Indians. In a few short decades, Indiana would be emptied of the people that had given the territory its name.
After the war, John Connor was a wealthy widower who farmed 320 acres near Cedar Grove, ran several stores, owned 160 acres in Laurel Township, and owned plots of land that included the future site of Connorsville. He married Lavina Winship in 1813. Before the year was over, he platted 62 plots of land on the western bank of the Whitewater River. He called those platted parcels Connorsville.
Dr. Philip Mason visited the village in 1816. The same year Indiana became a state. Mason wrote, "A small tract of land had been laid off by John Connor into town lots, which lay along the river bank with two main streets running north and south, Main and Water Street. It's 2 blocks long and 5 blocks wide, where a few log cabins had been erected. Most of the land, which comprises the present site of the town, was then a forest."
Connorsville boasted 3 log houses, a trading post, and a sawmill. 3 years later, the first jail and wagon road were built. Another year, and Joshua Harlan had constructed the town's first brick building. It was located on 5th and Eastern and housed an inn and general store.
Connorsville's growth accelerated after it became the county seat in 1819. In 1820, 3,950 men, women, and children resided in Fayette County. By 1821, Connorsville had 2 lawyers, a doctor, and businesses ranging from a blacksmith shop to a jewelry store. The town's first newspaper, the Indiana Statesman, was founded in 1824.
By 1830, the village's population was 500 and growing. In spite of its semi-civilized trappings, it was still part of the frontier. The local paper reported that a black bear had to be shot after wandering downtown, and the Whitewater River had to be forded until 1842, when the village's first bridge was built.
Connorsville retained the legal status of village until the Indiana General Assembly passed an act and incorporated it as a town February 15, 1841. Joshua McIntosh, Aquila Hatton, George Freiberger, Robert Smith and John Noble were named trustees of this new town.
Travel to and from Connorsville was overland and treacherous. Inspired by New York State's Erie Canal, residents of the Whitewater Valley decided to build their own waterway. As early as 1822, delegates from the surrounding counties met to discuss building a canal that would provide access from Hagerstown to Connorsville to the Ohio River.
It took 12 years for the state legislature to conduct a survey for the project. The proposed canal would be 76 miles long and fall 491 feet thanks to 7-feeder dams and 56 locks. Cost was estimated at $4,908 per mile, or $1,142,126 for the entire canal. In January 1836, the Indiana state legislature enacted the Mammoth Internal Improvement Bill, which appropriated funds for building a network of highways, railways, and waterways across Indiana. $1,400,000 was set aside for the Whitewater Canal project.
Construction began on September 13th of the same year. In little under 12 months, the canal reached halfway from Lawrenceburg to Brookville. 975 men were paid $18 a month to dig the canal bed by pick and shovel. It took nearly 2 years to link Brookville with Lawrenceburg.
By the time the first canal boat arrived in Lawrenceburg on June 8, 1839, the state of Indiana had overextended itself and was close to bankruptcy. Work ceased for 3 years, and the canal project was taken over and sold to a Cincinnati company run by Henry S. Vallette. His Whitewater Canal Company was headquartered in Connorsville.
It cost $1,920,175.13 to finish the canal. The channel was dug deep enough to hold 4 feet of water and measured 26 feet wide at the bottom and 40 feet wide from bank to bank. In Fayette County alone, it needed 13 locks and 1 feeder dam.
The whole town celebrated when the first canal boat, the Patriot, arrived at Connorsville in June 1845. It was captained by Gale Ford, a Connorsville native, who went on to own 2 of the 25 boats that made up the canal's fleet. Ford's boats were packets that carried passengers between Connorsville and Cincinnati. The round trip cost $3 and included bed and board.
The canal turned Connorsville into an industrial powerhouse. Businesses began viewing the town as a good place to locate. In 1846, Geffert Stove Foundry and Roots Woolen Mills started manufacturing items in the canal town that were marketable clear across America.
Pork packing soon became Connorsville's leading industry. By 1861, Caldwell McCullum and Company was just one among a half a dozen packing plants that butchered over 1,000 hogs a day.
The Whitewater Canal Company's books list some of the freight handled at the Cincinnati terminal during the month of January 1851.
19,522 barrels of flour, 2,780 barrels of lard,
1,131,218 pounds of pork, 7,841 bushels of wheat,
14,177 bushels of corn, 92,380 feet of lumber.
Connorsville was responsible for the lion's share of the freight that was shipped through Cincinnati to the entire United States.
Prosperity brought in more and more businesses. The McFarland Buggy Company was founded in 1856, and in the same year, Irwin, Mount, and Mulliken started manufacturing threshing machines in a building at 10th and Eastern.
3 years later, Philander H. and Francis M. Roots started making rotary positive blowers at their woolen mills. The blowers, invented by the Roots themselves, are still famous around the world.
The golden age of the Whitewater Canal ended when railroads succeeded in providing the Midwest with fast, reliable passenger and freight service. In the 1860s, the disused canal was sold to the Whitewater Valley Railroad Company for $137,348.12. Tracks were laid on the towpaths, and trains ran where mules once pulled canal boats.
the election year of 1860, America was a house divided. Slavery pitted Northerners against Southerners. Kansas was a bloody battleground where slave owners fought free staters to the death. Fresh in every American's mind was the image of John Brown, hanged by the United States government for trying to start a slave rebellion at Harper's Ferry.
Up until that year, the residents of Connersville and the rest of Fayette County had been staunch Democrats. That changed, however, after the Republican State Convention was held in Indianapolis. The Marching Connersville Republican Club won the hearts of 50,000 Republicans in attendance and carried the first prize banner back home to Connersville.
The Connersville Weekly Times enthused.
Abe's boys went to Indianapolis with a determination to bring back a good name, whether they got the banner or not. And had some other company carried off the prize, they would have joined them in rejoicing and not have accused them, the good and true Republicans, with being knaves and scoundrels.
Fayette County's population during the election year of 1860 was 10,140. Connersville's was 2,119. The county cast 1,343 votes for Abraham Lincoln, 917 for Stephen Douglas. After the polls closed across the nation, Lincoln had beaten Douglas by 482,880 popular votes and 162 electoral votes.
The South scrambled to prepare for secession and war. Sitting President Buchanan reneged on his plans to reinforce federal forts in the South at the urging of his pro-slavery friends. Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated as America's 16th president on March 4th, 1861. A little over a month later, Connersville received the news that Fort Sumter had fallen.
The very next day, Indiana's Governor Oliver P. Morton telegraphed President Lincoln and promised him 10,000 soldiers. The state was ordered to raise 6 infantry regiments. 4,608 Hoosier men would serve the Union for 3 months.
On April 25th, the Connersville Times reported that
Great enthusiasm has existed all week.
Fayette County Guards, 100 men strong, had already tendered their services to the governor. W.W. Freiberger had organized a cannon squad.
Plans were made to raise money to outfit more Connersville troops and provide their families with financial relief.
On August 1st, 1861, the Connersville Weekly Times reported,
Captain Carlin's company, composed of citizens of Fayette and Rush, is nearly full and will leave for Indianapolis in a few days. It is composed of good material and with the necessary drilling and discipline will be prepared to meet the enemy in bold and effective charges.
The Indianapolis Journal praised another Connersville detachment on September 11th.
Freiberger's artillery. This well-manned, well-drilled, and well-appointed corps, with their battery of 6 guns, left at 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon for St. Louis. No better, more efficient, 147 men have left or will leave the state of Indiana for the seat of war. We expect to hear good accounts of Freiberger's battery.
The Adjutant General of Indiana reported that Fayette County sent 65 commissioned officers and 1,449 enlisted men to the war. This meant that 15% of the county's men served in the Union Army.
Freiberger's artillery served in Missouri from 1862 through 1863. It later fought in the Red River Campaign and at Nashville and Mobile. The rest of the Fayette County men were scattered throughout a host of regiments.
Thompson Alexander was assigned to the 5th Indiana Cavalry. The letters he wrote his sister Alecta describe both the mundaneness of camp life and the ferocity of battle. Thompson's December 1863 letter from Bean Station, Tennessee, contains a miniature diary that captures the life of the Union fighting man.
Friday, December 4th. Lay in camp till near sundown when we took up our line of march in the direction of Knoxville, marching 4 miles, camping. Then 150 from our regiment of the 65th was sent 8 miles to Plodding Springs Gap. Saturday, December 5th. There was a report that the Rebs are advancing and trying to get around us. After standing in line of battle till almost nightfall, we went into camp. Sunday, December 6th. Left camp early in the morning. We crossed Cedar Ridge and was soon engaged with the enemy, our regiment in the advance. We drove them till dark when we camped on the battlefield, lying by our fires without our blankets, with our horses bridled and saddled. No alarm through the night. Orderly Sergeant of Company L mortally wounded. Tuesday, December 8th. Woke up and had breakfast and started to Knoxville, getting into town at 9 o'clock. We went over to the battlefield. Looked like a slaughter pen where the Rebs charged on the fort. There were pools of blood in all directions. In the ditch around the fort, their old hats were lying all around, and nearly every one had a bullet hole in it.
1 year after his sister received this letter, Thompson was still alive, but interned in a Confederate prison camp.
John M. Orr became the highest-ranking officer from the county after being promoted to the rank of colonel. 3 Connorsville men served as field surgeons: Joshua Chitwood of the 7th Cavalry, Vincent Gregg of the 12th, and Daniel Hall of the 36th.
The war years turned out to be boom years for many northern towns. Connorsville was no exception. Demand increased mightily for goods needed by the Union Army: leather, canvas, guns, horseshoes. Local farmers sold more and more produce to feed the troops.
The railroad reached Connorsville in 1862, connecting it with Indianapolis and Cincinnati. Fast and reliable transportation further energized the town's industries. The Connorsville Weekly Times reported September 5, 1861.
Roots Woolen Factory is the most extensive establishment of its kind in Indiana. It contains 20 looms and employs usually about 50 operatives, male and female. At the present time, 75 are employed. The machinery is kept running day and night in manufacturing woolen kersey for the Army.
On April 10, 1865, the telegraph lines carried the news that Lee had surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Businesses closed, church bells rang, guns were fired again and again. People filled the streets marching, shaking hands, laughing, crying, singing. The Connorsville Times observed,
It was a day made for generations, and our children will hereafter hold it in grateful memory.
The celebrating ended April 15th, when Connorsville received the news that President Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. The Union had been preserved at a terrible cost.
Spring 1867 saw the arrival of Connorsville's second roadway. The Towpath Railroad, built by the Whitewater Valley Railroad, connected the growing town with Cambridge City.
A year later, the Board of Trustees appointed Joseph H. Hilligoss to conduct a census that would establish whether or not enough people resided in Connorsville to justify its obtaining a city charter. Hilligoss's findings revealed that as of June 20th, 1868, 2,890 men, women, and children lived in the town.
11 months later, every prominent citizen of Connorsville signed a document petitioning the town board to apply for a city charter. The first to sign was Daniel Wrench, the last, William Newkirk. A referendum was held on June 16, 1869. 300 out of 365 ballots were cast in favor of transferring the town of Connorsville into the city of Connorsville.
The new city was divided into 3 wards. City officials were elected. William H. Beck became mayor, C.D. Smith, marshal, and John Ewell, treasurer.
Ordinances were drawn up to define the city's boundaries and regulate its affairs. Ordinance number 22 provided for a waterworks to be built with pumps purchased from the Hawley Manufacturing Company of New York. Fire hydrants were placed throughout the city. The fire department's pump wagons, Pluto and Ocean, were retired and a new fire chief appointed.
Only 3.5 months lay between the time Connorsville dissolved its town board system and the creation of a working city government. Of course, those were the days before cities relied on the state and federal governments for grants, funding, and red tape.
According to the U.S. Census of 1870, 10,467 people lived in Fayette County, 2,496 lived in the new city of Connersville.
As Connersville grew, so did the crime rate. A police department had to be organized in 1885. Ordinance number 218 established a three-man force. 2 years later, a pair of officers were added to patrol the city at night. Policemen worked 12-hour shifts and were armed with nightsticks.
By this time, Connersville streets were well lit. Ordinance number 102 had given a franchise to the Connersville Gas Light Company to run mains underneath the city and replace its oil-fueled street lamps with ones powered by natural gas. Connersville was gas-lit on Christmas night, 1875.
12 years later, the city awarded a franchise to Thompson Houston Electric Light Company to
Erect the poles and install the wiring and other apparatus for the purpose of supplying citizens with electric lights.
On August 1st, 1890, Connersville entered the electric age.
Businesses continued to multiply. Furniture manufacturing became one of Connersville's leading industries. The Connersville Furniture Company, founded in 1882, found buyers for its lifelong furniture all across the United States, Canada, and Mexico.
4 years later, John B. McFarland Sr. turned that part of Connersville known as Edgewood into a gigantic industrial park. The first business to build there was McFarland's own buggy company. Other businesses followed suit. 16 firms built manufacturing plants on John McFarland's corn patch.
The Connersville Furniture Company, the McFarland Carriage Company, the Connersville Natural Gas Company, Anstead and Higgins Spring Company, the Connersville Blower Company,
Rex Wheel Works, George R. Carter Company, the Indiana Lamp Company, Triumph Safe and Lock Company, the Central Manufacturing Company,
The Lexington Motor Company, the Hydroelectric Company, the Central Manufacturing Company, the Anstead Engine Company, and the Stantz Manufacturing Company.
And the E.L. Cord Company.
The magnificent McFarland Hotel opened in June 1896. A special illustrated edition of the Daily News reported.
Last night witnessed the ultima thule of all social functions in the city of Connersville. Never since the Garden City of the Whitewater rose from her cornfields have the businessmen of Connersville been gathered in such a brilliant assembly as last night's banquet in the new McFarland Hotel. When 20 years hence, Connersville shall have grown to its full stature, this handsome, stately, and imposing monument will still be abreast of the times.
February 15th, 1898. The United States battleship Maine is blown to pieces in Havana Harbor. Spanish sabotage is suspected. 3 months later, the Spanish-American War begins.
Young men from Connersville and Fayette County answered their country's call. The enlistees were attached to the Indiana Volunteer Infantry, the United States Volunteer Engineer Corps, and the United States Signal Corps.
Mercifully, the war lasted only 3 months, ending August 12, 1898. Cuba was free. America had gained Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. And the men from Fayette County came home in plenty of time to welcome in the 20th century.
At the dawn of the 20th century, 6,836 men, women, and children were living in Connersville.
The age of the automobile had begun, and Connersville was not going to be left behind. Almost overnight, local companies that built carriages and buggies transformed themselves into manufacturers of automobiles.
In its little Detroit days, Connersville built and supplied parts for over 200 models of cars built in Indiana. Parts buyers traveled to Little Detroit for everything from leather trim to lamps to engine castings and car bodies. Cars completely built in Connersville were in demand all over the country.
The 10 makes of cars manufactured in Connersville from 1905 to 1937 were
The Central, the McFarland, the Lexington, the Empire, the Howard.
The Kelly Cycle Car, the Van Auden Electric, the Anstead, the Auburn.
And the Cord.
For 18 years, McFarland built some of the nation's finest automobiles. Their line included everything from limousines and touring cars to ambulances and hearses. The McFarland mission statement read, Daniel, It is
not 5,000 cars built to sell, but instead a limited number, each properly road tested, each a perfect individual in which you and ourselves can have a lasting pride and satisfaction.
McFarland cars finished third and fifth in the 1910 100-mile race at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. 1 year later, another McFarland participated in the first 500-mile race.
Kinsey Stone, a horse racer from Lexington, Kentucky, founded the Lexington Automobile Company in 1909. His chief engineer, John C. Moore, was responsible for Lexington cars out-rivaling their competitors in engineering, design, and performance.
The Rex Buggy Company turned itself into a nationally known manufacturer of parts for horseless carriages and horseless carriages themselves.
Rex sedan tops became hugely popular and topped cars off built by Buick, Dodge, Rio, Nash, Studebaker, Hupmobile, Hudson, Essex, Oakland, Cadillac, Haynes, Lexington, and the Chevrolet.
Connersville's population numbered 7,738 in 1910. This was the same year Mayor Gray obtained steam-powered waterworks that ended the city's dependence on filtered canal water by supplying Connersville residents with pure, deep well water.
Further civic improvements included replacing graveled and macadamized streets with ones made of concrete in 1912. Cement sidewalks followed, and by 1917, Connersville boasted 1,300,000 square feet of them.
In 1906, the Indianapolis and Cincinnati Traction Company provided Connersville with interurban service to Indianapolis. Electric traction cars arrived and departed promptly on the hour. The 2-hour, 55-minute trip to Indianapolis cost 90 cents, round-trip tickets $1.60.
Connersville decided to forego celebrating its own centennial in 1913 in lieu of celebrating Indiana's in 1916. Fayette County scheduled the 4-day celebration from June 2nd to 5th. Festivities began with a concert of sacred music and an address from the Reverend L.E. Brown on 100 years of Hoosier history. The city went on to celebrate with an automobile parade, a grand display of pyrotechnics, the presentation of a fountain to Connersville by the Clio Club, and a historical pageant written, directed, and staged by Miss Harriet E. Williams, a teacher at 5th Street School.
Connersville's artistic and cultural activities, however, consisted of much more than sacred concerts and pageants. The Andree Opera House, built in 1876, served as a venue for legitimate theater. Boasting a stage 21 by 46 feet, it seated 600 people.
The Andree was replaced by the Auditorium Theater in 1906. Rivaling anything in Indianapolis or Cincinnati, it seated over 1,200 people and hosted everything from comedy acts to epic stage plays to grand operas. The Squaw Man, featuring William Farnham, played there in 1907, as did Gounod's Faust. The A.G. Fields minstrel show played as well.
Motion pictures debuted at Connersville in 1908. Early theaters included the Crystal, the Bijou, and the Lyric.
Connersville's age of innocence came to an end on April 6, 1917, when America declared war on Germany.
Connersville leapt into action. Each and every resident wanted to do his or her part to help win the war to end all wars. The city was soon able to claim 950 men serving in the armed forces.
Reginald Fisher became the first local man killed in the war. A Navy gunner, he lost his life when his ship was torpedoed on December 6, 1917.
On the home front, many Connersville businesses won contracts from the Department of Defense. The Lexington Motor Company manufactured hemp rope for the Navy. The Stamp Machine Company bid plates for submarine engines, and the Rex Manufacturing Company stretchers for the ambulance corps.
According to the Evening News of February 11th, 1917,
The McFarland Motor Company has secured another war work order for cushions for 170 American ships. Made of waterproof casing and stuffed with kapok, the cushions are really life buoys.
A ship, in fact, was named after McFarland's hometown. Christened on September 14, 1918, the USS Connersville weighed 3,500 tons, stretched 300 feet, and could reach a top speed of 10 to 15 knots. The Daily Examiner explained that the city was so honored because Fayette County had provided more soldiers, sailors, and Marines per capita than any other American county.
By the time the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, the United States had lost 120,000 men. Indiana had lost 3,354.
Connersville and Fayette County had given 1,175 young men to the war effort. 31 never returned. Several of them had succumbed to the Spanish flu.
the flu reached America itself in October 1918. Although local doctors issued assurances it would never reach epidemic proportion in Connersville, residents soon learned different.
The city felt the pandemic's full force in December 1918. 20 new cases were reported every 24 hours. The hospital had been completed just in time for the epidemic. Fayette Memorial Hospital was filled to overflowing. Theaters closed. Churches were permitted to hold only one service a week. Customers were cautioned to spend as little time as possible in places of business. On December 31st, the Examiner reported 300 cases of flu and 175 homes under quarantine in Fayette County.
The flu finally burnt itself out in February 1919. Life returned to normal, veterans assimilated, and businesses boomed.
Hanstead Engineering built an 85,306 square foot building that made the Anstead-Lexington Motor Company complex a total of 3 blocks long. Lexington Motor Cars went on to sell 4,030 automobiles in 1919.
Connersville was entering the 1920s as a post-war boomtown.
Connersville was concerned, the first big news item of 1920 was the consolidation of the Connersville Evening News with the Daily Examiner newspaper.
The Connersville News Examiner offered this explanation on January 28th.
One of the causative considerations was the shortage of newsprint paper, the extreme scarcity of which had come to make the life of the county daily harder than ever before.
The month-old newspaper also noted that its creation was due to the scarcity of competent workmen.
Which was a bit hard to understand, since the News Examiner went on to report that Connersville was experiencing a population boom. And we quote,
"The Fayette County population totals 17,142, or a gain of 2,027 over 1910's census."
Connersville grew by leaps and bounds in the 1920s, annexing land to the north and west and almost doubling in size. One reporter observed,
Merrill's cow pastures, the land where the circus tents used to stand, is covered by new homes. The same is true of Hawkins Playground, while the northern part of the city, south of 30th Street, new homes are sprinkled here and there in what used to be a vast field. Building is going on continually all over the city. Where there is a vacant lot, a home is being constructed.
Thanks to the 1920 census results, Connersville had graduated from a 5th to a 4th class city.
It was also experiencing growing pains. Fortunately, the Democratic mayor, James A. Clifton, and the Republican city council took a united stand against the growing problem of vice in the city. The News Examiner trumpeted,
The lid is on in Connersville. Gambling and all other forms of commercial vice must go.
The newspaper provided its readers with a handy list of the commercial vices that were locally available.
Craps, poker, card games for money, punch cards, slot machines, bootlegging, moonshining, public intoxication, vicious social practices.
Mayor Clifton assured the citizenry that he did not intend these hellholes to continue in this city.
More positively, Connersville annexed East Connersville on July 13, 1922, thus prompting the banner headline, Greater Connersville Now a Reality. East Connersville had unofficially been part of Connersville for years. A village of 700 people, it was located on the east side of the West Fork of the White River. A man named Basil McCann had platted the settlement back in 1857. Its annexation had long been overdue.
Greater Connersville's economy became increasingly prosperous. Real estate transactions for 1922 set a new record, and in 1923, weekly payrolls at the city's industrial plants and retail stores reached an unbelievable $93,000.
The city's economic success was due to its production of goods that appealed to buyers all across America. Local factories produced everything from household furniture to industrial blowers.
Connersville's premier product, of course, continued to be the automobile.
One of the local car manufacturers made national news in 1920. Lexington Motor Car Company's automobiles were the overall winners in the Labor Day Pikes Peak hill climb. Driver Ott Lesh drove his Lexington to victory by completing the treacherous 12-mile, 2,200-foot ascent in 22 minutes and 22 seconds. 4 years later, another Lexington reached the peak in 18 minutes and 15 seconds. This victory garnered Lexington the coveted Penrose Trophy, promised to the first entrant to win the hill climb twice.
On January 15, 1929, the first of Auburn's 680 sedans to be built wholly in Connersville rolled off the assembly line. The manufacturing plant consisted of 20 buildings on 82 acres. 250 cars could be mass-produced in a single day.
McFarland, however, custom-built their vehicles. In October 1922, a company press release announced an order for a $25,000 gold-plated chauffeur-driven sedan. The buffed and finished car was displayed at the Chicago Auto Show before being delivered to its anonymous owner.
Social life in Connersville became increasingly interesting due to the passage of the 18th Amendment prohibiting the manufacture and sale of alcohol. In spite of the local police department doing its best to stem the flow of liquor, the dike called Prohibition leaked like a sieve. There were simply not enough fingers to plug all the holes. Moonshine stills and speakeasies sprang up like well-watered weeds. More than likely, the city's residents consumed more alcohol than they had before America and Connersville had become, well, dry.
Like most American cities during the Roaring '20s, Connersville had its share of flappers and sheiks. Young women bobbed their hair, rouged their cheeks, smoked cigarettes, and wore shorter and shorter skirts. The male counterparts parted their slicked down hair in the middle, wore knickers and argyle socks, and swore by their hip flasks. Both sexes shared the same interest in jazz, parties, and fast living. Members of the older generation roared through the '20s their own way, investing foolishly in the stock market, driving bigger and bigger cars, and living in finer and finer houses, spending more and more money, and never bothering to save it. In short, both generations lived like there was no tomorrow.
Of course, tomorrow finally came on October 29th, 1929.
the stock market crashed. Investors lost $40 billion in a single day. The party was over.
January 1st, 1930. The News Examiner reports,
The first day of the 30s was hailed throughout the land with carousing and solemnity, and all intermediate stages as became the individual desire. In the great cities, liquor flowed freely despite valiant efforts of prohibition officials.
Reading between the lines, we get the impression the liquor was flowing pretty freely because things were pretty rotten. The Great Depression hit Connersville like a hammer on an anvil. On the 16th day of the new decade, the local Board of Social Services and Charities reported,
The board is bringing relief to hundreds of families. The other day, 7 new families were found who had never asked for help before, but who are now compelled to. The breadwinners of these families had been out of jobs for several weeks, their small savings exhausted, and they were compelled to ask for help. There's not been a time in many years when the need has been as great as it is now.
According to the 1930 census, Connersville population numbered 12,795. A significant percentage of these men, women, and children were destitute. Following the lead of the Board of Social Services, the city formed an emergency relief committee on October 15, 1931. Its primary purpose was to help the needy during the winter months. On October 10, 1933, tax rates were cut drastically due, in the words of one politician, to the inability of the taxpayer to pay these high taxes. 2 weeks later, the junior high school cafeteria began providing free hot lunches for hungry students. And in November, trucks traveled throughout Fayette County, picking up donations of produce, canned goods, and used clothing.
the 1932 election swept Democrats into every office in Fayette County and Franklin Delano Roosevelt into the White House. After his inauguration, the president declared a bank holiday. On March 6, 1933, every bank in America closed. Those found solvent would receive federal funds and be allowed to be reopened.
In Connersville, the Fayette and Central State Banks were both allowed to resume operations on March 7th. A week and a half later, a local paper reported,
The local banks report that there are more deposits than withdrawals, while a check of the downtown district led to the belief that business in general underwent a substantial stimulation as a result of the withdrawal of restrictions that have been enforced.
WPA projects also gave Connersville a much-needed economic relief. The unemployed were put to work removing abandoned interurban tracts, landscaping a cemetery, and painting public school buildings.
Federal funds provided Connersville with an airport. The new Connersville City Airport was dedicated on September 15, 1934. A 3-hour stop in the city was planned by 35 planes.
State funds were used to replace the 5th Street covered bridge. The old bridge, built by E.L. Kennedy in 1887, was a beautiful example of Burr Arch Truss construction. The new bridge, begun on August 23, 1934, was a modern concrete arch, 7-span structure. It opened for traffic on November 28, 1935.
Connersville was honored with a whistle-stop visit from President Roosevelt during his 1936 re-election campaign. According to a local paper,
President Roosevelt's train car will be placed near the front of the Baltimore and Ohio station. The yards will be cleared in order to provide adequate room for the crowd expected to greet the executive.
Slowly but steadily, the economy recovered. Public confidence soared on December 16, 1937, when William E. Brown announced he was planning to construct a huge new business building in Connersville. According to the News Examiner,
Completion of the negotiations looking toward the erection of the modern structure and the long-term leasing to 3 widely known concerns is evidence of the faith of these concerns in the future of Connersville.
Of course, total economic recovery would have to wait until the industrial boom caused by America's life and death struggle with Japan and Germany.
After watching Germany and Japan gobble up larger and larger parts of the globe, the majority of Americans came to the conclusion that a Second World War was inevitable.
The Selective Military Service Act was passed by Congress on September 16, 1940. 1 year's military training was mandated for selected males aged 21 to 36. President Roosevelt designated October 16th as Draft Registration Day. According to the News Examiner,
A total of 2,481 men registered in Fayette County for the Selective Military Service. Of this total, 1,925 were from the city of Connersville.
In 1940, Connersville's population numbered 12,898. 15% of that number registered for the draft. The ratio was close to 13% for Fayette County as a whole. The first Fayette County men drafted were Harold Cox and Clifton Zell. They left for Fort Benjamin Harrison on the morning of November 22nd, 1940. This meant Connersville's entry into the war effort steadily grew.
June 23, 1941, the News Examiner reports,
Connersville has been designated as a defense area by President Roosevelt. A telegram was received by the News Examiner this afternoon from the United States Senator Frederick Van Nuys, stating that the President has designated this city as a defense area and it is hereby eligible for loans and assistance to private enterprise in the building of houses.
The houses would be needed for the workers who would man Connersville's factories turned defense plants. Before the year was over, Barnes Construction Company announced it had signed a $1,126,900 contract to build the 300-unit housing project. According to the News Examiner,
the contract calls for the completion of in 130 calendar days. 62 acres located just north of the city will be used as the site for the housing project.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Corporal William H. Offutt, stationed at Hickam Field with the 17th Air Base Squadron, became the first Fayette County man to be killed during World War II. Connersville would later honor Corporal Offutt by annexing the 62 acres housing project and renaming it Offutt's Park on January 2nd, 1942.
Germany declared war on the United States 4 days later. Adolf Hitler made this chilling promise. After victory has been achieved, Germany, Italy, and Japan will continue in close cooperation with a view to establishing a new and a just order.
America was fighting for its very life.
government regulations reflected that fact. On January 1st, 1942, the News Examiner published the following notice.
Sales of new tires and tubes will be limited under rationing quotas announced by the Office of Production Management. Fayette County will get 16 tires and 13 tubes in January for passenger cars, light trucks, and motorcycles, with heavy trucks and buses getting 32 tires and 27 tubes.
The very next day, Mayor Ross Castle announced, "I have been authorized by the Office of Production Management to stop all sales of new automobiles and trucks in the city of Connersville until January 15th, 1942.
In 1942, America, faced with a produce shortage, recommended that its citizens start planting victory gardens. In February, a meeting was held in Connersville to encourage everyone from grade schoolers to adults to grow as many of their own fruits and vegetables as possible.
Fayette County and Connersville's civil defense was overseen by Air Raid Warden C.O. Sams. The News Examiner explained that Sams traveled to Indianapolis to learn
how to deal with incendiary bombs, gas defense, blackout, map making, high explosive bombs, civilian morale, and other life and death matters should Indiana be attacked from the air or the land.
In April, sugar rationing began. Coffee was next on the list. Citizens were allotted enough coffee for 2.1 cups a day.
In May, the Fayette County Rubber Salvage Committee urged everyone to support the war effort by contributing
Solid tires along with bike, baby carriage, play wagon, lawnmower, and wheelbarrow, rubber tires and tubes, including beads and rubbings, old patches, boots, and reliners.
The city of Connersville held a victory exposition the next spring. The exposition's slogan was, "Know your Army and the weapons it uses to protect your liberty." Among the local manufacturers that exhibited were
Auburn Central Manufacturing, wings for the Vultee Vengeance dive bomber, Jeep bodies, and bomb bay doors and turret decks for the B-24 Liberator bomber.
Rex Manufacturing Company, aircraft depth charges, bazookas, mortar shells, Navy helmets, and lockers.
Steel Kitchen Corporations, parts for Navy Scout observation planes and Army Air Force cargo planes, parts for M4 tanks.
McQuay Norris Manufacturing Corporation, precision parts for Jeeps, tanks, and airplanes.
One of the workers who helped produce these parts was Betty O'Leary, Connersville's own version of Rosie the Riveter. Right after her husband left to join the military in 1943, she hired on at American Central to help win the war by riveting airplane wings together. Betty was typical of the millions of women who joined the workforce to maintain America's war machine and keep the country's industries, businesses, and utilities going.
Fayette County and Connersville residents did more than their part during the war loan drives. During the fourth drive, cash sales of war bonds exceeded the $1,168,500 goal by more than $900,000 3 weeks before the campaign ended on February 29, 1944.
That same year, the Fayette County chapter of the Red Cross announced it had produced over 1 million surgical dressings.
May 7th, 1945. The Allies accept Germany's unconditional surrender. Factories, businesses, and schools close. Thanksgiving services are held at the senior high school and the First Presbyterian Church. The News Examiner enthused.
Flags were displayed throughout the business district. The parade and factory workers from various plants constituted the biggest demonstration locally.
August 16, 1945, Japan surrenders. VJ Day is celebrated in Connersville with a victory parade that ends at the courthouse. Mayor Ross Castle presides over a memorial service for those who lost their lives in the war.
2,600 citizens of Fayette County served their country in World War II. 57 of them died in the effort to free the world from tyranny.
It was months before all the servicemen and women returned home.
One of them was Private First Class Floyd Herman Moore. He participated in the Normandy Beach landing and 5 major battles in Europe. After Germany's surrender, he served in the 8th Field Artillery Observation Battalion at Camp Boston, France. On October 11, 1945, he wrote to his bride-to-be, Miss Irma Lois Britton, a letter that dealt with his life in occupied Europe and his dreams of returning home to her.
My darling Irma, this is truly a beautiful afternoon, but it would have seemed even more so if only there had been a letter from you. Last night I was fumbling around on my radio, trying to find some good music. On the way across the dial, I tuned in on stations in France, Germany, Russia, China, and finally New York. Early this afternoon, I took a stroll over to the library, and like most other places here in Camp Boston, the room was jammed with soldiers. Irma, I am, as you can guess, just living on the dream of when we're together again. Love, Herman.
Herman and Irma were married after his return home on December 15, 1945. After a long, happy marriage, Herman passed away July 14, 2010. Irma, 86 years old, still resides in Connersville.
Private Herman Moore and the rest of Connersville's servicemen and women returned home to a city whose industries were once again manufacturing peacetime products. Americans were more affluent than ever and ready to buy.
Rex Manufacturing turned out refrigerators. The company would later become part of the Philco Corporation.
American Central not only built refrigerators, but also kitchen cabinets and sinks. The firm would later become known as AFCO.
Early in 1946, Porcelain Steel Products installed continuous furnaces, automatic sprayers, and chain conveyor belts that enabled it to turn out thousands of feet of finished porcelain a day.
Connersville gained 2 new manufacturing plants in June 1946, Metal Plating Corporation and Production Products, specializing in metal stampings and platings.
In 1945, a drive to fund the construction of a YMCA building started on April 23rd. The campaign was kick-started by a $17,500 contribution from W.E. Brown. The new Y opened on September 10, 1950.
In March 1948, the Public Housing Administration announced that the 300 houses in Offutt Park would be put up for sale. Prospective buyers had to register their intent to purchase and make a good faith deposit of $60. Prices ranged from $2,905 to $3,250 for single family dwellings and $5,525 for doubles. The announcement stipulated that veterans be given preference.
According to the 1950 census, Connersville boasted a population of 15,545. The city had gained 2,647 people in 10 years.
The city's growing stature prompted Turner Airlines to establish a feeder service that connected Grand Rapids, Connersville, Cincinnati, and Louisville.
June 27, 1950. North Korea invades South Korea. The Korean conflict begins. Though starting life as a police action, it soon escalates into full-blown war after North Korea receives Red Chinese Army reinforcements and Soviet military aid.
The Fayette County Draft Board informed the public that its first call of 36 men had just been up to 68. The News Examiner explained,
Orders telling of the nearly 100% increase were received this morning at the Fayette County Selective Service Office in the basement of the post office. Mrs. Mabel C. Volz is the clerk whose job it is to select the names from that list.
One of the men selected was Ralph Gerald Rathburn. The 21-year-old died in Korea on August 12, 1950.
Once again, several Connersville industries engaged in defense work. The War Department awarded American Kitchens several military contracts, including one for anti-submarine mines.
In response to America's growing tension with Red China and the Soviet Union, AFCO discontinued its white goods line and focused on development projects from the U.S. government.
Most Connersville companies, however, continued turning out goods for American consumers. Rex Manufacturing announced it was building a 420,000 square foot factory on land that had once been farmed by the Ostheimer family. The new plant would produce air conditioners, refrigerators, and freezers.
On October 31st, 1958, Connersville industrialist Sam N. Regenstreef informed the city that he was forming a new company to produce plastic products. Regenstreef based his company in the plant formerly belonging to the AK division of Avco.
November 4, 1952, Republican candidate Dwight D. Eisenhower becomes the 34th President of the United States.
Eisenhower's popularity as war hero and president radically changed the political climate of Connersville during the election of 1955. The News-Examiner reported,
Riding the crest of a 367-vote majority, R.L. Doc Haley, Republican yesterday, ended this 8-year Democratic administration of Mayor Glenn R. Henderson with a resounding triumph that not only carried him to victory in Connersville's mayoral election, but swept into office with him as city clerk, treasurer, and 5 out of 7 councilmen.
March 3rd, 1958. The News-Examiner runs the following headline.
Historic downtown landmark goes up in flames.
One of Connersville's oldest buildings, the former Andre Opera House, had burned to the ground. For 30 tense minutes, a large part of the city's business district was in imminent danger of suffering the same fate. Fortunately, quoting once again from the News-Examiner,
All of Connersville's firemen, including Junior Rogers, who had been bedfast all day, were on the job, and coming to their assistance were firemen from Rushville, Richmond, Liberty, Everton, Glenwood, Milton, Cambridge City, and Shelbyville.
Another disaster hit the city on September the 8th. A broken axle sent train cars shooting off the B&O line into trees, yards, and houses near the 11th and Western Overpass. Steel girders and train cars seriously damaged the railroad trestle as they crashed onto the street below.
The decade closed with former Mayor Glenn H. Henderson winning the mayoral office back from Republican R.L. Haley. Henderson garnered 469 more votes than his opponent. Voter turnout reached a record high thanks to 7,491 out of 10,648 registered voters braving a chill November drizzle to cast their ballots.
In 1960, 17,698 people lived in Connersville, 2,153 more than in 1950.
The increase was due in large part to Ordinance 147, passed on September 16, 1957, which annexed another residential area near the city. The News-Examiner explained,
The annexed land includes substantial residential areas, but also includes industrial sites, including this present Rex Manufacturing Company plant, and the land of the county infirmary, where Roots Connersville Blower contemplates extensive expansion.
November 8, 1960, John F. Kennedy narrowly defeats Richard Nixon to become America's 35th president. In his inaugural address, Kennedy issues this challenge.
Go ahead and say it.
My fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Back in Connersville, another piece of history was lost when fire destroyed the Nichols Hotel on June 7th. Flames gutted the upper stories of the building. Smoke and water damage took care of the rest. The century-old building had started life as the Occidental Hotel.
February 26, 1961. The B&O line grabs the city's attention once again. Another broken axle sends 21 railroad cars careening off the tracks. 8 of the cars carry poisonous and potentially explosive chemicals. 60 homes are evacuated. For 5 days, Connersville police and fire departments work arm in arm with the National Guard to control the situation. A canteen opened by the Red Cross is staffed by members of the Gray Ladies, JCs, and Kiwanians.
October 15, 1962. The United States discovers the Soviet Union is building medium and intermediate range missile sites in Cuba, and President Kennedy institutes a blockade of the island. Premier Nikita Khrushchev warns Kennedy that the American blockade constitutes
an act of aggression, propelling humankind into the abyss of a nuclear war.
After the crisis is diffused through furious diplomatic efforts on October 28th, Connersville and the rest of the world breathe a collective sigh of relief.
June 1963 marked the 150th anniversary of the founding of Connersville. After months of preparations that included a queen contest, old-fashioned window dressing by shop owners, and historical fashions worn by many Connersville residents, the city celebrated for 8 days. The keynote address at the opening luncheon was given by Indiana Senator Vance Hartke. Another guest of honor, former Mayor William Dentlinger, commented,
I'm 79 years old, and I have to say Connersville has never seen anything this big.
The luncheon was followed by a Little Detroit parade of automobiles and the Greater Connersville 150th Anniversary Ball, at which Carol Ingram was crowned queen.
Over the next 7 days, activities included everything from a muzzle loading competition to a watermelon eating contest. The high point of the Sesquicentennial was the premiere of the epic pageant along the Whitewater Trails. The performance took place in Roberts Park.
2 months later, Connersville residents sat in front of their television sets and watched 250,000 people participate in the March on Washington. On August 8th, the whole nation listened to Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, which ended with the words,
Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Like most Hoosier cities, Connersville had a lot of room for improvement when it came to realizing Dr. Martin Luther King's dream. Black citizens were still segregated. They were regulated to the balcony of the local cinema, given paper cups instead of glasses at the drugstore, soda fountain, and banned from the swimming pool at Roberts Park, dedicated to all the children of Connersville. In 1963, the News Examiner quoted Indiana Civil Rights Commissioner Director Harold O. Thatcher. The commission seeks to discourage any persons from engaging in discriminatory practices by informal methods of persuasion. The black community interpreted that as meaning, stay in your place, we've got this. According to Connersville native Michael Ellis, informal methods weren't always effective. Mr. Ellis was one of the city's African American residents who crusaded for civil rights in the 60s and the 70s. At age 16, he and a friend successfully integrated the Roberts Park Pool in 1964. In an attempt to do the same, the main floor of the local cinema, though ending unsuccessfully, gave the manager some food for thought.
November 22nd, 1963. President John F. Kennedy makes a campaign swing through Dallas, Texas. As his motorcade passes by the Texas School Book Depository, bullets strike the president in the neck and head. A half hour later, he is pronounced dead.
Diane Flum was a freshman at Connersville High School at the time, and she remembers,
It's one of those memories in which you always remember exactly where you were when you first heard the news. I was in PE class, the last period of the day, and we girls were in the locker room. Suddenly, everyone was whispering the news that President Kennedy had been shot and maybe had died. We were all shocked and in disbelief. After that, I remember how silent everyone was. For days, we all watched the news incessantly about the president's death and then the funeral on TV. An image that stays in my head is that of little John Kennedy saluting his father as the casket passed by.
Diane's husband, Dan, was a junior at Fayette Central High School at that time. He recalls,
I was in study hall when the principal announced over the PA system that President Kennedy had been shot and fatally wounded in Dallas, Texas. Silence. I went home. My dad, my brothers, and I had to go out in a heavy rain to feed the hogs and milk the cows. After finishing our chores, we all went inside the house and were glued to the TV for the next 3 days, as most of the country was.
Connorsville formally mourned its president on Monday afternoon, November 25th. According to the News Examiner,
A sorrowing throng, young, middle-aged, and old, gathered at the Moose parking lot early Monday afternoon for the ceremonies sponsored by the combined patriotic organizations of the community's final tribute to President John F. Kennedy.
a picture of the president, draped in black, hung in the glass house window.
After 30 days of mourning, the nation adjusted.
West 21st Street, Connorsville, Indiana. Early December 1963. Marvin Myers and Dave Moore are hanging out at Marv's house following their bowling league.
Hey Marv, is that a Sports Illustrated magazine you got there?
Yeah, it is, Dave. It's an old copy John Connor was about to throw out.
You mean Lloyd Vale?
Yeah.
Okay. Anything interesting in there?
Well, here's a story about the world's record for the longest Monopoly game. Back in '61, some fraternity people at the University of West Virginia played a game for 132 hours. You know, Dave,
Oh, come on, Marv. Don't get any ideas.
We could do this. It's only five and a half days.
How are we going to stay awake for that long, let alone play Monopoly? And who would want to do it anyway?
You don't have to stay awake for 5.5 days. All you need are a few of our friends to come in and play with us. Who knows? Maybe we could get on one of them TV shows.
David and Marvin attend the Spartans game at the Spartan Bowl that night. David plays in the pep band and Marvin roams the bleachers, both trying to persuade other students to join them in the pursuit of a world record. On the first day of Christmas vacation from school, the game begins at Marvin's mother's house on West 21st Street with 3 seats at the table. They started with 3 players in case one of them was knocked out of the game during early play.
Early on, we realized that we needed a public place to play, and the only place that we could think of that was open 24 hours a day were the laundromats. So we got kicked out of a few of them. I guess the owners thought that we were just a crazy bunch of kids. They didn't realize that we were very, very serious.
Very. Candace Murray, in one of her articles in the News Examiner, and she followed us every day of the game, she put out the call that we needed a more permanent place to play. Mm-hmm. And you know, the next day there were 3 or 4 people that answered our call.
We chose the UAW Union Hall, which was located at that time on 4th Street, right across from the police station. The UAW made us an offer that we couldn't refuse. They had a large picture window that we set our game up in front of, and people actually drove past and watched us play in there, and it just seemed to document our record better.
After we exceeded the old record, Candace Murray had invited me over to the News Examiner office to proofread an article she was about to put out on the National Wire Service when, a little bit of magic happened. Just as she was about to submit that on the wire, a story came back on the wire saying that there was a group in St. Louis that had just set the world's record for the longest Monopoly game. Yeah, they probably read the same article you and I read.
Probably.
Well, so we just laid low and decided to wait until we found out more about their game, right. And we just stayed in secret and didn't let anybody know then that we were playing. And after a few calls, we found out they had stopped playing, but they were still a day and a half ahead of us.
At that point in time, we were about 10 days into our game, so we just decided to make it at even 2 weeks and waste our entire Christmas holiday vacation break. Some of the local businesses like the A&J and Bunky's Pizza provided food for us, and the local cab companies back at that time, the City Cab and Royal Cab, made deliveries to us free of charge. And then on top of all that, we realized that we were running low on money. So we called Parker Brothers, that's the maker of the game of Monopoly, and told them of our dilemma, and they promptly sent us $1 million in play money and delivered it from Chicago to Connorsville in a Brinks armored car.
It's true. It's true. One of the other things I remember is that the UAW, where we were playing, gave us one of those big metal chests, pop coolers, and it was clear full of a variety of different soft drinks. We tried our darndest to get to the bottom of that cooler, and we couldn't do it by the end of our game.
Yeah. When we finally stopped, we'd set the new world record at 336 hours, 1 minute, and 15 seconds. The game actually ended. The game actually ended on 20th Street near the school in the upstairs of a home, I think, owned by Mr. and Mrs. John Lee.
Yeah. And about a week after we finished that game, I called Parker Brothers and I told them they had to get a PR guy to see if they could get us on one of those TV shows. And within a week, we had a solid appearance scheduled, and it was supposed to be live from New York.
Yep. Got it.
Be seated if you will. You'll find out your names and where you were from. You, sir, first.
My name is Marvin Myers from Connorsville, Indiana.
Marvin Myers, Connorsville, Indiana. And your name, sir?
David Moore of Connorsville, Indiana.
No relation to Gary Moore from Baltimore, Maryland. So, Mr. Myers, Mr. Moore, Marvin, and Dave. Now, gentlemen, if you'll whisper your secret to me, we'll show it at the same time to our audience at home. It's your, All right, now, Dave, can you tell me some more about that? Oh, boy. Give you a very broad clue this time. The clue concerns something they did for 14 days and nights. And the girls have not had a chance of questioning yet, so let's go to Betsy, please.
All right. You know what I thought you had done when you said these two names, Myers and Moore? I thought that you were going to give me away with my old age, and that these were going to be the sons of two boys that I went to grammar school with, because one was Myers and the other was Moore. But thank goodness
Did
you're
your
not.
dad run around with them? No, for heaven's sake.
Now then, did you do this above the earth?
Above the earth?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
You did.
Yes.
Did you do this?
When you say above the earth, do you mean suspended in air, or do you mean just above ground?
Well, like they weren't in a tunnel or a
Right.
hole in the
All right,
ground,
yeah.
something like that. Did you do this inside of something? Were you inside of a...
Sometimes.
Sometimes you're in, sometimes you're out.
Mostly they were in. $20 down, $60 to go. We go please to Henry Morgan.
Were you in something dangerous?
No.
Were you doing it as, was there something, wait, always an area I just, were you doing it the way college kids do to be nonsensical? You know, like how many can get in a phone booth and so forth? Anything like that?
Yes.
Oh!
It was in the nature of a stunt. $40 down, $40 to go. We go please to Bess.
A stunt. And it was some kind of endurance contest that you put yourselves through. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And you did this for 14 days and 14 nights. Did you? Yeah, I know. Did one of you or both of you stay awake for 14 days and 14 nights?
No, ma'am.
That was a different boy. No?
That's what Henry thought it was, and that's not it.
I thought perhaps one of you didn't sleep for that length of time.
You both slept during the period, didn't you?
Yes.
$60 down, $20 to go. We go please to Bill Cullen.
I think I know. I read something about one or several boys who, for a long period of time, went around shaking hands. And they shook like 32 million hands.
Well, we shook hands, but that isn't our secret.
That's a wrong book I read. That's the whole thing, yeah.
Don't read that.
Did you spend 14 days together in a phone booth?
No, we didn't.
Trying to get the right number with the common.
All right, we lost the $80. Panel, we're indeed proud to have these two young gentlemen with us tonight because each of them is captain of a team which recently broke a world's record. In a great contest of skill and endurance, Mr. Myers' team defeated Mr. Moore's team in a non-stop 14-day and night game of Monopoly.
They stumped the panel, won $80 in prize money, and used the prize money to throw a party for all their friends. Parker Brothers sent a beautiful deluxe Monopoly game to each of the players who played.
Boy, Dave, those were the good old days.
Yes, they were, Marv. Can you believe that that was 50 years ago?
Yeah. Well, you know, some things never change. Hey, I'll give you $1,000 for the orange ones, for the yellow ones.
Ha, no way. You just want to own Marvin's Gardens.
I'll throw in a good out of jail free card for you. August 2nd, 1964. North Vietnamese forces fire on a U.S. naval vessel in the Gulf of Tonkin. March 8, 1965. 3,500 Marines land near Da Nang. A News Examiner editorial writer observed,
When Hoosier boys, blood is being shed in Vietnam, foreign affairs become hometown concerns.
The first Fayette County young man to lose his life in the conflict was Charles Jeffrey Martin.
In 1968, the nation was sent reeling by two assassinations. The first occurred April 4th. Reverend Martin Luther King was gunned down on a motel balcony the morning after delivering his I Have Been to the Mountaintop address. An interfaith memorial service was held at Connorsville Central Christian Church. Ministers from Jewish, Protestant, and Catholic congregations officiated. Mayor Ralph R. Newquist represented the city. According to the Fayette County Ministerial Association,
the underlying purpose of this service was to further the cause of brotherhood and understanding between men of all faiths, colors, and creeds.
Senator Bobby Kennedy was the next to die. The young presidential candidate was gunned down by a Jordanian immigrant on June 5th. The News Examiner published this tribute.
Many did not agree with some of the political views of Senator Kennedy, but it would take a heart of stone to ignore this image of him. He was a man of idealism with a passionate desire to make our country and the world a better and happier place for those of all walks of life.
July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong sets foot on the moon and tells the world,
one step for me.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
There's something happening here.
17,604 people lived in Connersville and 26,276 in Fayette County in 1970. The new decade would prove to be just as turbulent as the last.
Diane Flum remembers one of the decade's earliest tragedies.
My classmate, Ray Murphy, was a very nice guy, a friendly guy with a mischievous smile and glasses. We graduated together in 1967, and in 1969, Ray was sent off to Vietnam. He was a door gunner on a helicopter in the Army, but his helicopter crashed into the side of a mountain in bad weather in Vietnam in 1970. Ray never came back alive. He was the third person the class of '67 lost.
On the home front, the Connersville Human Rights Relations Commission, headed by Reverend Jeremiah Ruth, was still fighting for the civil rights in Connersville. In 1971, the commission, with its education director, Michael Ellis, presented a 10-point program to the Fayette County School Board. One of the points called for an integrated teaching staff that would provide role models for African American students. After being rebuffed by the board, Ellis, Ruth, and 50 supporters walked out of the meeting. But the progress had been made. 2 African American teachers were hired the next year. Philco Ford, H.H. Robinson, and other factories were expanding. The civil rights movement had an impact on their hiring practices. Philco hired more black professionals, one of them being James Gibson, an engineer who was from Connersville. H.H. Robertson hired Leonard Smithson, an engineer also from Connersville. Philco got many domestic workers in the plant and paid good wages and benefits, which helped the black community improve. Also in the 70s, Connersville hired its first black police officer, Sonny Roberts. The city also appointed the first black superintendent, as James Ellis was named the superintendent of the streets of sanitation.
1972. The Connersville High School boys basketball team wins the Indiana High School Athletic Association State Basketball Championship. On March 18th, the night of the championship game, Connersville star player Phil Cox sang the national anthem in IU's Assembly Hall. 17,427 basketball fans were there to watch the Connersville Spartans face off against Gary West. Connersville won 80-63.
A few weeks later, Cox was named Mr. Indiana Basketball. His record for points scored, 1,305, stood for years. He was inducted into the Indiana Basketball Hall of Fame in 2009. 2 of his black teammates, Gerald Thomas, made the All-State basketball team, and Jerry Ellis, who made the All-State football team in 1973. Jerry followed in the footsteps of his brother Greg Ellis, who had made the All-State football team in 1969. Greg played for the University of Michigan in the Rose Bowl game.
February 1st, 1973. Fire guts the Rex Philco buildings known as Plant 51. H. Max Walters writes,
The sudden loss of the building of the former Rex Manufacturing Company brings back memories of hundreds, even thousands of people who have either worked there themselves or whose relatives worked there. For over a century, this plant has produced a myriad of products which have gone to every section of the nation.
Connorsville residents were cheered by the rebirth of the Whitewater Valley Railroad. In the 1860s, the railroad had provided freight and passenger service from Valley Junction, Ohio, through Connorsville to Hagerstown. After being taken over by the New York Central in the 1890s, it stopped carrying passengers in 1933 and freight in 1972 and faced abandonment. Volunteers from Connorsville and Rushville founded a not-for-profit corporation, reclaimed the Whitewater Valley Railroad name, and resumed passenger service in 1974.
On January 30, 1978, the News Examiner announced that it had
returned to a normal production schedule after the first suspension in regular publication in over 90 years last Thursday and Friday.
The reason for the paper closing its doors temporarily was the great blizzard of 1978.
The worst blizzard in Indiana history dumped 15 inches of snow onto the previous week's 5-inch snowfall. From January 25th to 27th, high winds pushed the snow into drifts that stood as high as 10 feet. The wind chill temperature dropped to minus 51 degrees. Motorists were stranded. Hoosier cities and towns shut down.
In 1979, the second year of Jimmy Carter's presidency, the pro-American kingdom of Iran fell into the hands of radical Islamists controlled by the Ayatollah Khomeini. After 6 months under a Muslim theocracy, the Islamic rebels kidnapped 52 American embassy workers.
The hostage crisis would last 444 days until Jimmy Carter was replaced by an actor-turned-politician named Ronald Reagan.
Residents of Connorsville entered the 8th decade of the 20th century with the country reeling from record rates of inflation and unemployment.
17,023 people lived in the city of Connorsville, 28,272 in Fayette County. Most of them knew whom they would vote for in the upcoming presidential election.
After the votes were tallied on November 4th, 1980, the News Examiner's front page carried 2 oversized headlines.
Reagan leads GOP to victory.
And
local GOP candidates post near sweep.
Fayette County voters read the following news story hopefully.
Ronald Wilson Reagan won the White House on the crest of a conservative tide that swept the Republicans to control of the Senate for the first time in 26 years. And gave the president-elect a landslide mandate for his promise of a tougher America abroad and less government at home.
A few short months later, Connorsville residents held their breath as they watched ABC, NBC, and CBS play and replay John Hinckley Jr.'s attempt to assassinate the new president. The day after the attack, March 31st, Republicans and Democrats alike were relieved to read the headline.
Reagan reported improving following emergency surgery.
Another assassination attempt on a world figure occurred May 13, 1981. Pope John Paul II was shot twice as he entered St. Peter's Square.
According to the News Examiner,
news of the wounding of Pope John Paul this morning was met locally with great shock, as it was across the nation. Receiving the news, classes at both St. Gabriel Church School and St. Michael's School at Brookville were interrupted and prayer services were held by the students.
In 1981, the Connorsville Fayette County Library opened, replacing the old Carnegie Library that had faithfully served Fayette County residents for 70 years. The new building had shelving capacity for over 95,000 volumes.
Connorsville native Carol
Suzanne Day was named Miss Indiana Black Expo of 1982. Crowned at Snyder High School in Fort Wayne, she officiated at the Indianapolis-based expo, where she met celebrities such as Sugar Ray Leonard and Quincy Jones. Miss Day spent her year-long reign traveling across America, representing the expo and speaking to a wide variety of audiences.
In March 1983, Connorsville High School boy basketball team battled Anderson High at Market Square Arena for that year's state championship. At halftime, the game was tied 28-28. With 56 seconds remaining on the clock, Connorsville sank the winning shot. The final score, Connorsville Spartans 63, Anderson Indians 62. The Spartans had won their second state championship.
Celebrations erupted all across Connorsville. In the weeks following the victory, team members were honored with banquets, speeches, and awards.
Also in 1983, the Whitewater Valley Railroad guaranteed its continued existence by officially purchasing 18 miles of track linking Connorsville with Metamora.
January 28, 1986.
4%. Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
All 7 crew members die. One of them is a teacher named Krista McAuliffe.
Dick Constanza reported in the News Examiner that Connorsville High School teacher Terry Hillman had been in Cape Canaveral a few days before the tragedy. Hillman was there to learn about the Teacher in Space program. Constanza wrote,
Terry did not see Tuesday's launching. He had the TV set on in his classroom early in the morning, but turned it off when a second launching delay was announced. After he heard what had happened, he and his students watched the dramatic and moving story.
In 1987, another Connorsville High School team won an IHSA state championship. This time it was the girls' gymnastics team. Coached by Joanne Borders, the Lady Spartans beat the Columbus North by 0.2 of 1 point.
Connorsville freshman Katie Stern won an individual state championship. Stern won the all-around title by excelling in vault, uneven bars, balance beam, and floor exercise.
The team went on to win 2 more state championships. Connorsville High School had joined that elite group of schools that had won gold 3 times and accomplished the task in only 3 years.
June 12, 1987. Ronald Reagan stands before the Brandenburg Gate near the Berlin Wall and issues this challenge to the USSR's premier.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The Berlin Wall had symbolized the face-off between Western freedom and communist totalitarianism since 1961.
In 1989, America was stronger than ever. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, was bankrupt and disintegrating. In September, demonstrations broke out all across East Germany.
The German people didn't wait for Mr. Gorbachev to tear down the wall. They did it themselves on November 9th, 1989. Connorsville residents couldn't believe their eyes when they read the News Examiner headline.
New East German leader calls Berlin Wall relic of the past.
At long last, freedom had come to the former Soviet bloc nation.
Diane Flum recalls.
When she was 18 years old, foreign exchange student Nina Beraya came to Connorsville from Braunschweig, West Germany, and lived with us for the academic school year of 1989 to 1990. On November 9th, we watched the news late at night as people physically climbed up on the Berlin Wall on the west side. People had been fleeing the east that summer as borders had been relaxed. There was even a joke about East Berlin that the last one out of East Berlin should turn off the lights.
Thanks to the Reagan Revolution of the 80s, Connersville and America faced the future with confidence as the new decade dawned. In 1990, 15,500 people lived inside the city limits, 26,015 in the whole of Fayette County.
The Connersville High School Auditorium was renamed the Robert E. Wise Center for the Performing Arts in 1990. Wise, a 1932 Connersville High School graduate, had moved to California to realize his dream of working in the motion picture industry. He directed a total of 39 films. 2 of them, West Side Story and The Sound of Music, garnered him Oscars for Best Director and Best Producer.
Civic improvements continued. On July 6, the News Examiner reported that Fayette County commissioners were
taking another step towards remodeling the old jail for county offices now paying rent throughout the city.
Once again, however, national events intruded upon Connersville.
On August 2nd, the News Examiner ran the headline,
Kuwait appeals for help after invasion by Iraq forces today.
The United States immediately moved to form an international alliance that would liberate Kuwait in case diplomatic efforts failed. They did.
Operation Desert Storm was unleashed on January 17, 1991. The Allied coalition carpet-bombed Baghdad and other strategic positions in Iraq with 89,000 tons of heavy-duty ordnance. Before long, Iraqi soldiers fled Kuwait en masse. Many never made it home. Airborne assault forces wiped the Iraqi army out before it ever reached Baghdad. The war ended February 18, 1991, 6 weeks after the fighting had begun. Unfortunately, coalition forces left Iraqi President Saddam Hussein in power.
Connersville native Randy Upright was deployed along with 750,000 other soldiers to the war zone. Sergeant Upright served as a gunner on a laser-guided rocket system. Interviewed by the News Examiner, he recalled,
I can remember the times I couldn't see from you to me. The sand was as light as it got into all the equipment. As for the heat, it could range from 120 degrees during the day to 40 degrees at night.
He also remembered how the surrendering Iraqi soldiers
were kissing the American soldiers. You could just see this was not the way of life they wanted and that they were forced into war by the dictator. We really thought Saddam Hussein's regime would fail. But, of course, it didn't fall.
Upright went on to explain why he fought.
Our nation keeps the free world free.
In September 1992, Sports Illustrated for Kids featured an article about a young Connersville resident named April McDivitt. April began playing basketball in the local Boys and Girls Club and soon became a star player for elementary school teams. During her years at Connersville High School, April helped the Lady Spartans win 4 sectional titles, 2 regional crowns, and a Hall of Fame tournament championship. She was named Miss Indiana Basketball in 1999.
1992 was a banner year for lovers of Connersville history, thanks to the publication of Connersville, Indiana, a pictorial history by Harry M. Smith. Mr. Smith presented the Reynolds Museum with a copy of his richly illustrated volume on November 19th. In March 1993, a famed and signed lithographic copy of the Russ Irwin painting used on the book's dust cover was presented to Mayor Marion Newhouse. The print was proudly hung in the City Hall.
Fayette Memorial Hospital doubled its size in 1995 due to a $16 million building program. Additions were made to the hospital's atrium, emergency ward, cardiac care unit, and laboratory.
A total of 163 college women entered 1999's 500 Festival Queen contest. 33 were chosen princesses. One of those 33 became queen. Her name was Danielle Sloan. Danielle, a 1995 Connorsville High School graduate, was a senior at Ball State University. She was featured in the 500 Festival Parade, celebrating the 83rd running of the 500-mile race.
After serving Connorsville and Fayette County for 68 years, the Reynolds Museum closed its doors for the last time Sunday, November 28, 1993. The museum's historical artifacts were stored in anticipation of being placed on display again in a new building.
In the last month of the 1990s, Connorsville saw two of its high school students earn the right to perform with the Richmond Symphony Orchestra. The young musicians were Kara Thornberry, percussionist, and Michael Swope, trumpeter. Both auditioned successfully to play with the RSO at its annual Young Artist Concert at Richmond's Civic Hall.
The 1990s drew to a close with Connorsville and the rest of the nation feeling happy, safe, and secure. In 1 year and 9 months, all that would change.
January 1st, 2000 arrived in spite of Y2K, and life went on as usual. According to the U.S. Census, 15,411 people lived in Connorsville and 25,588 in Fayette County.
As far as Connorsville residents were concerned, the first big event of the new millennium was the pit stop that the Great Race made in their city on June 13, 2000. The cross-country vintage car race was sponsored by the History Channel.
128 teams participated. 2 were from Connorsville. Bob Budzell and his son Rich drove a 1935 Plymouth dubbed the Spirit of Connorsville. The other team was made up of Mike Sparks, an instructor at the Whitewater Technical Career Center, and 5 of his students. They drove a 1930 Model A Ford, restored over the course of the previous school year.
The race ended in Sacramento, California. The Connorsville WTCC team won first place in the X Cup Youth Division. The 5 student members received a trophy and scholarship money totaling $12,000. Bob and Rich Bozell won the Godfather Award for their support of the Whitewater Technical Team.
During the same year, Connorsville hosted the Babe Ruth World Series for 14-year-olds from August 19th to 26th. Celebrity and guests included Pete Rose, Dave Concepcion, and former Cincinnati Reds manager Sparky Anderson. Little League officials were so impressed by their Connorsville hosts that they brought the series back in 2002.
Since the Reynolds Museum had become too small to house Historic Connorsville, Inc.'s growing collection, a building was purchased at 103 and 105 Vine Street. The north end of the building became a new repository for Connorsville's historic relics. A ribbon-cutting ceremony and open house were held on April 22, 2001. A few years later, the museum doubled in size when HCI leased the other half of the building. Thanks to the additional space, the museum was able to display a McFarland carriage, a Rex buggy, McFarland Knickerbocker Cabriolet, several Lexingtons, and one Empire automobile.
In spring 2001, the Whitewater Valley Railroad concluded its rehabilitation of track in Franklin County. The railroad's Grand Central Station had been opened a year earlier thanks to the financial help from local donors.
September 11th, 2001.
Oh my God.
Michael Ellis, former resident of Connorsville, experienced the tragedy firsthand.
I was working in New York City. I was working in New York City for a security company, and my territory included mid to small businesses around the World Trade Center. It was a beautiful morning, blue sky, puffy clouds, and for New York, it was quiet. Vendors and customers were looking over their wares and I decided to have a cup of coffee before I went on my first appointment that morning. I entered the restaurant, got my coffee, and sat down to go over my presentation for the prospect I was about to see. I started to hear police and fire sirens. At first, it was few, and then they gained in number, so I knew there was something big happening, and it was close. I pulled together my paperwork, picked up my coffee, and headed toward the door. I saw two men walking down the street, one covered in ashes and the other holding him up for support. I glanced up and down the street and noticed a panic of police cars and fire trucks. I asked the man with the ashes on him what had happened. He told me 2 planes had hit the World Trade Center. I could not believe it. I ran to the corner, Broadway, and looked south toward the towers. There they were, both smoking. I could barely see the plane sticking out. I could barely see the plane sticking out of one of them. I scurried further south to get a better look. As I did, the first tower started to crumble and came down to the ground. I knew I would never see, nor did I want to see, something like this again in my lifetime. I ran down the block and around the corner to a 1-hour photo lab and quickly bought a single-use camera. I returned quickly as I knew the other would go, and I wanted to document it. It did. I took pictures of the remaining tower and it came down. I also took pictures of people who had been closer, coming up the street in their now ashy clothes. I took a picture of a police van full of ash and the mayor's mobile bus used for occasions like this. I kept walking toward the remains, but now the police were setting up barriers and keeping us away. So I turned around and headed toward the subway to get to my office. But now a terrible thought ran through my mind. My firstborn son was on the subway, which went underneath the World Trade Center. I tried to call him on my cell. No answer. The cell site had been on top of the World Trade Center, which now was demolished. I had to wait in line to use a payphone. I got through and found that he had been stopped from boarding the subway, so he was safe. He had been trying to get in touch with me. Unfortunately, we could not call out of the city, so my second-born son was going crazy trying to get in touch with us. He worked in Stratford, Connecticut. Many merchants put out water and bread for us who were walking. We appreciated that. I kept hearing booms and would look to the sky, but a cop told me it was underneath the ground. He also told me that 2 other planes had crashed and they thought there might be 10 in the sky. This quickened my pace. Subways had quit running near the World Trade Center. I walked for blocks until I could get on one on 23rd Street. It was jammed. I got off at Grand Central Station to take the train to Connecticut. It was packed to every inch. When I got to Stratford, where my youngest son worked, I noticed police and fire crews and EMS. I got off briefly to ask what, if anything, had happened there. He said they were there to help anyone on the train, and nothing had happened here. When I got to Milford, my stop, it was the same thing. I got off and the policeman gave me a bottle of water and asked me if I needed medical help. I drove my car to the parking lot, and he filled me in on what was going on. I appreciated that ride and came home and watched TV. I called my son to tell him that we were all right. He came right over, gave me a big hug, and told me that he had been worried. He could have lost 2/3 of his family that day.
Osama bin Laden, the mastermind behind the attacks, was given sanctuary in Afghanistan by his Islamic fundamentalist regime, the Taliban. Before year's end, the Taliban had been driven out of power, bin Laden had gone into hiding, and the UN Security Council had set up the International Security Assistance Force to occupy the defeated country.
We were aware of world events, but much of our time was focused on local traditions. When summer came, for example, it was time for the free fair.
From 1884 to 1903, there had been no fair in Fayette County at all. That changed, however, when Colonel James E. Roberts donated Roberts Park to Connorsville, and Mark Meyer promptly came up with the idea of using it as the site of a free fair. So, in 1903, Fayette County hosted the first free fair in the state of Indiana.
The parade that opened the 102nd Fair had a record-setting 225 entries. The News Examiner reported,
One group received boisterous applause all along the route. Local veterans who served in the Gulf War, Bosnia, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and the conflict in Afghanistan were represented. Included in the Army of Veterans were several local National Guardsmen from the 76th Brigade, just back from Afghanistan. The veterans were escorted by Korean War and Vietnam War veterans.
fair festivities included everything from a banjo pickers contest to horse and pony games.
September 1, 2005, Hurricane Katrina, the sixth strongest storm in American history, devastates portions of Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Hardest hit is the city of New Orleans. 2,000 people died. Thousands are left homeless.
Connorsville and the rest of Fayette County were quick to respond. The Salvation Army collected cash for storm victims. Water, Gatorade, and non-perishables were dropped off at the Fayette County Democratic headquarters. The Chamber of Commerce teamed up with the Connorsville GM Center and the PKG Express to collect relief items. A radio-a-thon was hosted by WIFE Radio.
The year 2006 marked the 100th anniversary of the creation of the first public high school band. The creator of that band was Connorsville's own Dr. Otto Meissner. The idea occurred to Dr. Meissner as he watched 3 of his students suspended for misbehavior, keeping time as they listened to the music of a minstrel show. Dr. Meissner struck a bargain with the boys. If they would agree to learn to play instruments in his new band, he'd reinstate them. The students practiced seriously after Meissner promised them uniforms in school colors and a public concert.
After the 1906 concert, the News Examiner observed,
The first high school band in America, featured in last night's concert, was lately organized by Mr. Otto Meissner. To the audience, their playing was the greatest surprise of the evening. Their work was most excellent. If proper management is given by Connorsville people to the high school band, there might come an opportunity for them to win much credit and applause elsewhere.
To celebrate 100 years of high school bands, the Marching Spartans received brand new uniforms costing a total of $36,000.
On September 27, 2006, the Fayette County Courthouse was added to the National Register of Historic Places. Originally built in Greek Revival style in 1849, it has been renovated repeatedly during the last 150 years. During the last renovation, an historic mural by Jacob Stahl was rediscovered and restored. It can once again be seen on the ceiling of the circuit courtroom.
the Whitewater Valley Railroad continued to improve. A depot was moved from Rushville to Connorsville in 2008. Authentic railroad signals were erected near the Dearborn Tower, and the millionth passenger rode the Valley Flyer on October 18th of the same year.
On November 4th, 2008, the News Examiner ran the headline,
Obama elected president.
Barack Hussein Obama became the first African American to be elected President of the United States of America.
2.5 years later, the new president's administration succeeded in tracking down and killing Osama bin Laden, the man behind 9/11. The News Examiner quoted Bob Irwin, a member of American Legion Post 1, as saying,
I think it's great. It's about time.
it was a sentiment shared by an overwhelming majority of Americans.
In 2012, the News Examiner celebrated 125 years of reporting the news to Connorsville residents.
The paper can trace its roots back to the Connorsville Examiner, founded December 24, 1867, by John Milton Higgs and F.N. Pickett. The News Examiner Company was founded January 1, 1920, by E.W. Tapman. The paper remained in his family's hands until being sold to Nixon newspapers in 1992.
It was easy for a man to dream a town in the 1800s, a piece of wilderness, a diagram scratched on a sheet of paper, a trip to the recorder's office, and, if the platted land had advantages, water for travel, trees for lumber, soil for produce, that man's dream would come true.
You could see it happening all across America. Men and women would dream. Families would arrive, houses would be built, villages would spring up.
The hard part was growing that village into a town and that town into a city.
It didn't just happen. It had to be worked at. Blood, sweat, and tears had to be shed copiously. The cultivation of a city had to be mastered.
But many didn't master it. Their failures dried up into ghost towns or blowing dust or ink fading away in old books.
The question that arises is this: why do so many towns turn into forgotten graveyards and others into metropolises teeming with life?
The answer is not that some settlements simply enjoy super advantages.
The answer is rather that the community is able to see into the future and use that vision to adapt, innovate, and thrive.
So the secret of Connorsville's success is simply this:
It saw the future and reinvented itself over and over again.
Over the course of its life, Connorsville has been
Trading post, military outpost, frontier settlement, canal town.
Furniture builder, meat packer, grain distributor, mill town.
Carriage maker, automobile producer, defense area, and
appliance manufacturer.
Connorsville recognized opportunities and grabbed them.
Saw needs and filled them.
Dreamed dreams and realized them.
And 200 years after its founding,
it is still doing the same.
Hey. To go back? How are we supposed to go back?